what is actually ADHD?
Okay, so ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And I just want to clarify a couple of things here. Attention deficit is not correct, but we will be discussing that in this episode. And also, ADHD is not a disorder of the brain. And you know, this, if we think about progress in terms of science, we can say now, since we've developed the telescope, just because we can see more stars doesn't mean they weren't there before. We just have this ability, more understanding, and this is really important. Now, we also, again, just to make it more complex, we live in a chronically stressed modern day world. Okay, people really struggle with chronic stress for various reasons.
Doctors say that chronic stress can cause ADHD. Can you clear up that myth for us, please? Because you just said it actually cannot cause.
This is, you know, it can look like somebody's not doing anything. However, in the mind, really busy. Where do I need to start? What do I need to do? Things like, you know, when we're thinking about timekeeping, people may get frustrated because you arrange to meet your friend who lives with ADHD and they're late. And you think it's because they don't care enough to manage their time effectively, that your time with them isn't important enough. And that's not correct. I think that's an area that will change. It's just taking time. We absolutely know that emotional regulation is an important part of a lived experience of someone living with ADHD. And that's because
the birth of this podcast is deeply personal. I've poured out countless hours into finding the right guests, shaping each conversation, and crafting every episode with intention. My drive comes from a live experience, from pain, resilience, and a desire to make a difference. By subscribing, you're not just supporting a podcast, you're helping grow a community built on healing, honesty, and real impact. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the episode. Thank you.
Is your brain damaged? Well, maybe not. Dr. Evans and I had put together this series so you can understand the brain. Last week we discovered anxiety, and this week we will be discussing ADHD. We will be talking about what to look out for and the possible cause. Also, next week we will be talking about dementia. Did you know that dementia could actually show up 9 to 18 years before it actually started? Discover that and more in this series, the early sign and how could we prevent it before it actually starts. If you have been watching this series from the start, let us know in the comment section. Let us get into the episode. Dr. Evans, how are you doing?
very well, thank you. How are you?
I am blessed. We're going to get straight into the episode. And before we start the episode, I would like us to have a word of prayer. Do you mind praying for us?
Absolutely, that's fine. Okay. Dear Lord, please be with me as I share information around health on the Ivy Cancer podcast. Please help me and the Ivy Cancer podcast to reach those people that need inspiration or just understanding at the moment. And please ensure that they know there is always something that we can do to improve our health. Amen.
Amen. Nice. We will be discussing ADHD. And I want to know, what is actually ADHD?
Okay, so ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And I just want to clarify a couple of things here. Attention deficit is not correct, but we will be discussing that in this episode. And also, ADHD is not a disorder of the brain. It's a neurodevelopmental condition. So I will be referring to it in terms of a condition or an atypical brain, meaning there is differences between an atypical brain in terms of the neural circuitry and what would be considered a typical brain. Now, there are lots of different traits that can show up with ADHD. So there's variations. So how it looks for one person and in terms of severity will be very different to other people. But in terms of the diagnostic criteria, it's suggested that there's hyperactivity present, there's impulsivity present, and inattentiveness. Now, we will be discussing how actually it's much more complex than this, but this is how we understand it and how it's diagnosed at the moment.
So I want to understand, what is ADHD beyond the attention of deficits and hyperactivity?
Brilliant question, and exactly where we need to be going, because ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition, as I said, meaning there's differences in neural circuitry, how the brain communicates with certain networks. And this can be from a functional perspective and a structural perspective. What does that mean? Well, what we see are challenges around executive functioning. Now, executive functioning is things like attention, focus, planning, emotional regulation. That can include also impulsivity, but it is more than that. We also see challenges around motivation and reward seeking, meaning that sometimes people will become in terms of the motivation, it can look like people that live with ADHD may be lazy, they're not motivated to do things, and it really isn't anything to do with laziness. It's to do with neurobiology. The motivation and drive to do some tasks is simply not there. It's not interesting enough. It might be boring. It might be repetitive, meaning the attention shifts, maintaining that attention. It becomes really, really challenging. We also need to think about the fact emotional regulation is a challenge, so big emotions, and also sensory processing. Now, these are things that are not considered in terms of diagnostic criteria, but these are most certainly traits that we know present in ADHD. So it's much more complex than simply attention deficit hyperactivity.
We're living in an age where one doctor would say we have a world of sick people.
Mm.
And I often hear people talk about ADHD, and it kind of confuses me because sometimes when I look on people and they say they have ADHD, I'm confused. So why do many people say that everyone now is living with ADHD or diagnosed with ADHD comparing to much younger?
Yeah, okay. And again, this is a really significant question, given that West Streeting has announced this week or in the last week that he wants a review into the amount of cases of ADHD, referrals, for example. And there's a few things to consider here. So there is seemingly a trend of people they have ADHD. And we need to be clear about the fact that ADHD traits can show up in people. That doesn't necessarily mean they have ADHD. We also need to consider the fact we are much more understanding. You know, I said just a moment ago about how ADHD is much more than attention deficit and hyperactivity. We know much more about it now. And, you know, this, if we think about progress in terms of science, we can say now, since we've developed the telescope, just because we can see more stars doesn't mean they weren't there before. We just have this ability, more understanding, and this is really important. Now, we also, again, just to make it more complex, we live in a chronically stressed modern day world. Okay, people really struggle with chronic stress for various reasons. It can be poverty, it can be worry about climate change, job security, this kind of thing. And chronic stress can lead to changes in executive functioning, which we'll talk about in more detail during this episode, that can look like ADHD, but it is not ADHD, and chronic stress doesn't cause ADHD. Another reason why it's incredibly important for us to be recognizing and diagnosing people accurately, and again, it's something that, you know, that we can touch on, when we miss the opportunity to intervene and manage ADHD symptoms, we have to be clear that some of the alterations in neural circuitry make individuals potentially more at risk of being impulsive and committing crimes, reckless driving. Emotional regulation challenges mean that they can become more angry. And so we need to really be providing interventions and support around those cases for people that may have ADHD. So those diagnoses are important to access the resources necessary.
You mentioned something earlier, and it left me kind of confused because I've often heard doctors say that chronic stress can cause ADHD. Can you clear up that myth for us, please? Because you just said it actually cannot cause it. So can you clear that myth up for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some suggestions. You've got some people like Gabor Mate, and he thinks that trauma can cause ADHD. And so, you know, we have to be clear that when we're looking at science, science will always evolve. However, at the moment, we believe that ADHD is around 80% heritable, meaning it's genetic. What can then happen is environmental factors can come in and interact with, let's say, the genetics that can lead to the development of ADHD. And some of those environmental challenges or factors can be maternal smoking, maternal stress, and also adverse childhood experiences, so stress in childhood. However, those environmental factors alone currently are not considered to cause ADHD. The genetic component is there already, and there's an interaction. It's like the coming together of conditions that will tip the development of the brain in favor of ADHD.
So, in other words, or let me ask, people that's born with ADHD, there's a possibility that they have someone else in the family with ADHD.
Absolutely, and it is a question that gets asked. Now, remember, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I do know, I've spoken with psychiatrists, I've done courses, and this is something they look at, is family history. Usually there will be persons in the immediate family that have already been diagnosed.
On the topic of children, how does ADHD show up differently in children versus adults?
Okay, and again, really good question, because actually it does show up differently. And we need to remember that a child's brain, from conception through to like late 20s is still maturing. Now, the developmental part of ADHD is present. How that manifests will change as the brain matures. And so some examples around that would be, for example, in children, you will see maybe fidgeting and this kind of restlessness that's very external. However, in adults, this is more likely to be an internal restlessness, not being able to unwind, racing thoughts, a very, very busy mind. Then in a child, for example, it might be forgetting to take a book to school or to do homework, where in an adult, it will be around organizational skills, not being well organized, maybe forgetting to make appointments or having poor timekeeping. It can be, for example, with children, interrupting, impulsiveness, not being able to wait their turn. In an adult, that may present as oversharing some information. And also something we can talk about is very often presentation of ADHD is masked in adulthood. And this is particularly relevant to women.
We're going to get to the masking in a bit, but what are the most misunderstood symptoms of ADHD?
I think it has to be the fact that ADHD is a behavioural issue. You know, we talk about laziness, being quite restless, impulsive. And it's much more than what you see on the outside. There is so much more that's actually going on in the inside the mind. And this will be things like, talking about motivation, knowing that something has to be done, but really struggling to get on and do it, to actually start a task, or even know where to start a task.
So
This
procrastination then?
Absolutely. And this is, it can look like somebody's not doing anything. However, in the mind, really busy. Where do I need to start? What do I need to do? Things like, when we're thinking about timekeeping, people may get frustrated because you arrange to meet your friend who lives with ADHD and they're late. And you think it's because they don't care enough to manage their time effectively, that your time with them isn't important enough. And that's not correct. People, that live with ADHD can become incredibly hyper-focused on something and have kind of time blindness, have no idea what time it is, how long they've been thinking about or doing a particular task. And I think, when we're talking about things like emotional regulation, it's very, very difficult for people who live with ADHD to manage their emotions. The circuitry in the executive functioning hub, the prefrontal cortex, it is atypical, meaning the ability to regulate or decompress after a stressful situation is so much harder.
Why is that?
That's because the prefrontal cortex is involved in emotional regulation. So it communicates with the limbic system, which is kind of the emotional hub of the brain. And if you've got the emotional hub, normally, typically what will happen is we will be able to use the prefrontal cortex, our executive functions, to say, you know what? I know this is stressful, but there's other solutions. What can I do about this? So use our planning part of the brain, our reasoning, rational part of the brain to communicate. Actually, this isn't such a big deal. For someone living with ADHD, they're not typically able to access that information or that circuitry as quickly. And we only have to think about, for example, in children, when it looks like poor behaviour, emotional dysregulation will look like a meltdown. But actually, for that child, it's big. It really is very, very big. And it's hard to regulate emotions as a child anyway.
So if you see a child having, like, for instance, you've been speaking to your child and you start, like you would say, please, Tommy, put that thing down, and he just act out a character and start screaming and start throwing himself down on the floor. Is that possible ADHD?
Well, we do have that in children at certain ages anyway, and
Yes.
that's so that would be very difficult, and you would need somebody to be looking at different traits to be able to diagnose. But remember, diagnostic criteria doesn't include emotional
I,
dysregulation at the
I'm glad
moment.
you said that, because some people would look at a child that's throw themselves down and say, oh, that child have ADHD. They
Yeah.
tend to assign ADHD to every behavior a child has. And for me, I don't, because I used to see these things a lot when I was growing up. E-
Mm,
Even my daughters,
mm,
sometimes when they can't have their own way, they just snap, you know. But when I'm here in the UK, people associate that child with
mm.
ADHD. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. I'm glad you cleared that up. So
Yeah,
people
no,
would realize, like, listen, that's actually a part of their growth.
it's part of their growth. Remember that a child will look to an adult to help them co-regulate. This is part of their experience.
Mm-hmm.
And, having big emotions is something that children will have. And it's about them learning that is learning to regulate them themselves,
Mm-hmm.
to self-soothe in healthy ways. But we need to remember that although it's not part of the diagnostic criteria, we do know that emotional dysregulation does present in ADHD, mood instability, etc. And what it means is the ability to self-soothe in a healthy way is going to be harder to access.
Okay. What does a live experience feels like to a day to day? Is it typical or is it varied?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about a typical brain and atypical, it's really important that we recognize that within typical and within atypical, there's going to be variations. So within and between. So all of our lived experiences are different, but the challenges that somebody with ADHD will face, if we're thinking about adults now, for example, on a day-to-day basis, ADHD will touch all aspects of their life. It will affect things like relationships,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't mention actually that rejection sensitivity is something else that's not considered as part of diagnostic criteria. So criticism and rejection is very powerful. And of course, it can lead to very big emotions, should I say, and that's important to recognize in relationships. But also thinking about impulse control, impulse control means that this regulation to not act so quickly in what we say, what we do, and what we do. That might be, for example, for some people, it will be losing their temper, saying things that they regret afterwards, not having the ability to pause before acting or saying. This is a trait, absolutely. It's harder to regulate. And so impulsivity will also include purchasing with money that you don't have. It can also include, for example, substance use, or making decisions that may end up putting you in jail. So we need to look at, we also know that risk taking is bigger. Now, this can also be sexual risk taking. And, all of these things, this is what I mean about, employment stability. If you're not able to manage time, if you're not seen to be reliable, for example, if maybe it looks like you're missing deadlines or you're not able to effectively plan your work without the right access to the right resources within the workplace, it can really cause some big challenges. And these are day-to-day challenges.
So you said right resources. What are
Hmm.
some of those resources like?
I think there's a lot of conversation around this at the moment, and I don't think there's a clear answer. And I think we need to have an element of personal agency,
Mm-hmm.
and that means recognizing what areas we're struggling with and making sure that our employers are aware and are able to put accommodations in place. Because
Right.
remember, these traits are very, very different. So I think we need to have more flexibility in the workplace. So if, for example, somebody is not, we know that working memory is affected. Okay, what does that mean? So that would be typically you knowing, today I need to remember to call the vet, I need to pop and get some bread, and I need to cancel an appointment. Now that is much harder for someone who lives with ADHD. So if you imagine in the workplace, boss pops his head in the office, says, oh, don't remember to do X, Y, and Z. And then a couple of minutes later, don't forget to do X, Y, and Z. And this kind of communication for a particular person may actually be really challenging because they will forget. And if they forget, does it look like they weren't listening?
I was going to ask you if there's an issue with forgetfulness as well, because
Yeah.
sometimes you actually go about to do something
Mhm.
and probably got distracted and you totally forget what you was about to do. So I was just going to ask you that as well, because I think that happens to me a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Distraction. I mean, we talk about, if you think about attention deficit is not about not being able to pay attention, it's about attention control. And there's a region of the brain, the default mode network, where our mind, it does wander.
Mm-hmm.
And for someone that lives with ADHD, that switch may be stuck in the on position with the brain wandering. And this can be seen in young girls with daydreaming.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like being not listening or paying attention. This happens to boys as well, but it's quite common in girls with, like, they're not listening, and it's not, the mind is diverted to
Mm-hmm.
something completely different. And that isn't an intentional not wanting to listen, but becoming distracted. And of course, that may happen also in the workplace.
Right.
And you see that because there is this idea that people that live with ADHD say they have multiple, it's like they've got multiple tabs open at the same time in their brain.
Mm-hmm.
So you start working on something, start remembering something. Now you're going on to another topic, and then you go on to another topic. And what actually you end up doing is spreading your attention very thinly to each individual
Different
topic
things.
rather than focus. But on the other side of that, people that live with ADHD can have hyperfocus, where they will find something they're interested in and then will lose sense of all time for hours, forget to eat, forget to drink, and their attention is hyperfocus.
So in other words, ADHD have different levels or different traits.
Yeah, so I think the one of the differences in terms of the neural circuitry includes dopamine and norepinephrine. And this will be motivation, attention, focus. And what this means is interest can be lost very quickly in something. So novelty is quite important. And if something's repetitive, that interest will go. And being motivated and able to concentrate on something is really difficult. On the other hand, if something engages the attention of someone with ADHD, then the complete opposite will happen. So you can see there's like more extreme polar ends than maybe the typical brain.
Would you see the same trait in somebody with dyslexia?
I don't know the answer to that. Now, dyslexia is neurodevelopmental condition and can often sit alongside ADHD.
I know you don't cover. I know you don't cover that
Mm,
dyslexic, but it just the trait just seems so similar to me with
yeah,
dyslexic. So that is the reason why I
possible.
ask.
Yeah, it's very possible. It's
I, th-
certainly something
I
for me to
I
have a look
think
at.
some of these what you call it,
Neu-
neurological disorder,
Neurodevelopmental condition.
neurodevelopmental. I think they are families, you know.
Yeah,
'Cause,
'cause, I mean, very often there's crossover.
yeah,
Very often there's
I think
crossover.
there's some correlation.
Yeah.
Um, are are there any specific brain region implicated in ADHD and what they actually do?
Yeah, so we were talking about executive functioning. So that is the prefrontal cortex, this
Okay.
region here. Okay. And so this is where attention, emotional regulation, focus, impulsivity, planning, timekeeping, not becoming overwhelmed. This is this region of the brain. Primarily, okay, so this is a circuitry that we're talking about. So there's other regions there, but we'll call that the prefrontal cortex. Then we also have the reward and motivation circuitry of the brain. So this is the basal ganglia, which includes the nucleus accumbens, but also the ventral tegmental area. So collectively, this region will, for example, project to the prefrontal cortex dopamine that will help with this focus, with motivation. So remember, we have to be really careful that we're not isolating certain areas. It's about communication between different circuits, because within each circuit there's lots of different regions, for example, and types of brain of cells that produce different neurotransmitters. But those are key areas that we're pretty sure are implicated in ADHD from doing different scans.
Okay. Earlier you spoke about dopamine
Mm-hmm.
and how our dopamine motivate and self-regulation linked in ADHD.
Yeah, and this is because in ADHD, either dopamine levels or dopamine receptor sensitivity is altered. And so if you think about it, dopamine is involved in kind of pleasure seeking, motivation, kind of getting on and starting your day. And, we need to remember that neurotransmitters often work together, but dopamine's very much involved in memory learning, but also motivation. And so because of either a reduced amount of dopamine or a lack of receptor sensitivity, the message that dopamine carries doesn't get to where it needs to go to carry out its job.
Dopamine. I know what is dopamine,
Mhm.
but I don't know how to break it down. Is dopamine the feel good hormone or that what is
No, it's a neurotransmitter.
oh, that's a neurotransmitter.
It's a neurotransmitter. So if we think about our neurons, they will receive a signal. The signal will go to what we call a synapse,
Mm-hmm.
where dopamine is released into a synaptic cleft,
Mm-hmm.
where it will then attach to the receptor on a post synapse and carry its signal. So it's like a conveyor belt. So dopamine is released from a cell, from a neuron. It will now bind to the receptor of another neuron until it gets to where it needs to go. That says something like, let's start this task. Now, if there isn't enough dopamine, or the receptor's not responsive to it, it's like a traffic jam.
Oh,
Okay, if you think, well, not even a traffic jam, but an obstacle in the road.
okay.
And so that's the way I would think about the neurotransmitters and how they work. So dopamine is going to come from kind of the reward circuitry. We want to get it to the prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
And if there isn't enough, then the signal when it gets there isn't going to be great. It's going to be like, well, there's not much motivation here. Or there might be enough dopamine, but the receptor is not, the dopamine is not getting the message into the area it needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't recognize the message, basically. So motivation isn't activated. And that's the way we need to think about the way the brain works. It is like all of these different circuits and communication. And if the message doesn't get to where it needs to, then the action can't be performed.
I see. I see. Why is emotional regulation such a big part of ADHD, yet it is rarely discussed and not involved in the diagnostic criteria?
Yeah, I think that's an area that will change. It's just taking time. We absolutely know that emotional regulation is an important part of a lived experience for someone living with ADHD. And that's because, remember the executive function region that we're talking, the prefrontal cortex? It's not just about attention. It's not just about impulsivity. It's also about emotional regulation and all of those other things we talked about, timekeeping, for example. And I think we only have to, I think, the other part to kind of recognize is the emotional state of someone can be quite hard to measure.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see how someone's acting in terms of their hyperactivity, can't you?
Yeah.
Or interrupting, you like being impulsive, that
Right.
kind of. So again, it's just that we need, these things are slow, but we do need to psychiatrists, I absolutely know, agree that we need to be updating our diagnostic criteria and taking this into account, along with things like sensory processing, rejection sensitivity.
Earlier, you cleared the air about chronic stress not causing ADHD, but can chronic stress worsen the symptoms of ADHD?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a couple of reasons why that can be. One, chronic stress in somebody who has a typical brain, it will affect their executive functioning.
Mm-hmm.
So someone who has an atypical brain, who already has alterations in executive functioning, it's going to antagonize that. The other thing is chronic stress is associated with high levels of cortisol. And cortisol is a hormone. And high levels of cortisol will lead to a down-regulation or reduction in the amount of dopamine. Now think about it. If ADHD is already associated with impairment in dopamine messaging, then chronic stress is going to further amplify that.
Okay. This is a big question
Mhm.
because I've tend to seen it a lot. And I would like to ask you as a neuroscience, why do women and girls still underdiagnosed?
Really, and again, brilliant question. And it's so significant at the moment. There's a lot of conversation around this. Doctors, psychiatrists are starting to stand up and say, we need to do better. One of the biggest reasons for this is that typically studies on ADHD were done around men, because female reproductive hormones complicate the picture. And so it was kept around men. And if you think about in terms of the hyperactivity and the impulsivity, for example, this does, the hyperactivity, not impulsivity, this is more commonly seen in boys, where girls can tend to be perhaps a bit more inattentive or kind of a daydreamer. But the other thing, and this is really important to realize, is females are more able to be compliant. So they mask, they will adapt to societal expectations of them. And so because of all of this, the presentations that can be different, in females, and because they weren't studied, it was studied in men, diagnostic criteria was developed around male presentation. And my understanding is for every 3 boys that are referred, only 1 girl is.
You mentioned masking for the second time, and we're just going to get there. Like, what does it mean when people say people with ADHD mask? What is masking?
So this is actually adapting your behaviours to meet societal norms. This can look like people pleasing. This can look like trying incredibly hard to regulate emotions. Things like timekeeping. You know, for someone with ADHD, timekeeping is incredibly difficult. So they will have many, many timers, for example, small example, but many timers for lots of different things because they're worried they're going to forget. It's not sustainable. And it's why we see masking of presentation often leads to burnout. But also because of people masking the symptoms or the presentations, the challenges they face around living with ADHD. It's really, really hard when there's kind of the social battery runs out.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, when someone gets home, struggle to unwind, to decompress. And we need to think about how these kind of people pleasing or being that person that says yes or I can do, how that affects somebody in the long run. Because we do know that in order to unwind, we can often see substance misuse, alcohol misuse, things like comfort eating, binge eating, disordered eating, gambling.
So all of that fall under masking?
No, but it's what the masking is, because when someone can't be authentically themselves,
Right.
they have to find an outlet in the end.
Ah,
And so it's part and parcel of that, part and parcel. But the masking is about not being authentic, being what society expects you to be, and not being your true self. Think about what kind of toll that takes on you when you're out in public or when you're in the working environment.
Because you mentioned people pleasing as well. But what about perfection or shame?
Yeah, so shame is actually because of, I did a workshop actually with Professor James Brown on ADHD and shame, and it was really, really interesting because of shame is about inherently thinking that you are flawed.
Okay.
And some of the challenges that people that live with ADHD face, and they hide or they can't be authentic, by not being open and honest, it feeds the shame. Shame thrives in silence. And we have to remember society at the moment is not making the adjustments that people who live with ADHD really need. They're not having access to the resources that they need.
So people with ADHD get less attention.
No, it's not about
Society.
attention. It's not about attention.
Or support.
Understanding. and therefore access to resources to support them. Remember when we were talking earlier about when if you're in the workplace and you become forgetful, or your timekeeping is compromised, or maybe you act impulsively, or you're unable to appropriately regulate. And something else that's really big is like sensory processing. If something's too loud, there's too many lights, there's too much noise going on, this becomes a distraction. And
Okay.
it makes it even harder to focus. So it's about recognizing the challenges each individual faces, and then making sure that we have the right resources in place to support them.
A lot of women get diagnosed with ADHD in their midlife. Why is that?
Yeah, that is because we also now know that during the menopause stages, so perimenopause, we see fluctuations in reproductive hormones. And if we take estrogen, for example, estrogen and dopamine, they actually they regulate each other. So if we are seeing fluctuations in estrogen, okay, and it signals to the prefrontal cortex as well, by the way. So even if you don't have ADHD, you see ADHD-like traits come up because of the estrogen changes in the brain. But also we have to remember that estrogen and dopamine have a relationship. So fluctuations in estrogen is going to affect dopamine, and dopamine is the neurotransmitter that is implicated in ADHD.
I get you. I get you. Um, what does recent brain scan research reveal about how ADHD brain different from the non-ADHD brain?
Yeah, so we know from looking at scans, different types of scans, at persons diagnosed with ADHD versus those not with ADHD. So we'd call that like a control brain, to compare. Have a look at lots of different images and see whether there's any specifics that are coming up. And there are small changes that have been identified in, for example, the basal ganglia and also prefrontal cortex. However, they're not diagnostic. They're not diagnostic markers, meaning you wouldn't be able to look at a specific scan of somebody and say, yes, this person has ADHD. We're not there yet. But we see small structural changes and also alterations in activity in the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia, which will match with the symptoms that we've been talking about.
Dr. Evans, I really like the fact that we are exploring the brain. I've learned about anxiety and I've learned about ADHD. I can't wait for us to unfold the things that we can do to actually manage or navigate through these phases or even prevent. Thank you for joining the Ivy Cancer podcast yet again. I really do appreciate your time, and I'm sure my listeners really appreciate it as well.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.